Great. Thanks so much, Rob. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. As Rob mentioned, I am a college counselor with Campus Bound, and prior to that, worked for almost 10 years in college admissions on the other side of the desk. So I've certainly read my fair share of recommendations over the years. I'm excited to talk with you tonight about how to make your recommendations stand out in the process. I want to start off with talking about the purpose of the recommendation. I know sometimes recommendations can cause a lot of stress for students. Who do you ask? When do you ask teachers for recommendations? How does this all work? I often get the question, what if the teacher writes a bad recommendation? Well, I'm here to tell you that there are very rarely bad recommendations, truly what you would call bad, where the person is really, the teacher is really questioning the student's character. There are also pretty rarely strong recommendations. I mean, strong, outstanding, really kind of push students over the edge of the admissions process recommendations. Most of the recommendations that I've read fall somewhere in the middle. So what I want to do tonight is talk with you about how you can choose teachers to write recommendations, how you can make sure that your guidance counselor knows you well to make your recommendations stand out and be some of the ones in the grouping of the strongest recommendations that really show the admissions committee who you are and what you can bring to their school. So really what admissions is looking for, and the reason that they're asking you for a recommendation, is for them to get some insightful and subjective information about you as a student in the classroom. What are you like as a student? Do you participate in class? Are you active in class? Do you get your work done on time? What do they see, in you as a student? Because that's what colleges are ultimately looking for, is what are you going to bring to the classroom at the institution to which you're applying. Another thing that recommendations do is that you're in control of who you ask for a recommendation. So this does allow you as a student to select teachers that you believe will write you a strong letter of recommendation that's going to be helpful in the admissions process. So I know that there's some concern about students saying, I don't know what they're going to write, but there's also some steps that you can take leading up to asking a teacher for the recommendation, and also the specific teachers that you ask that can also make a difference and give you a little bit more control over what type of information is going to be presented to the college about you. So identifying teachers to ask. Most colleges and universities will require you to submit 2 letters of recommendation, one from a counselor, one from a teacher. There are some schools that may ask you to submit 2 teacher recommendations. On average, we usually recommend that our students do ask 2 teachers so that they have a couple of different options and some flexibility there. And so you want to make sure that you're thoughtful in the teachers that you ask. So you want to choose teachers from your core academic courses. Those are teachers that you've had in English, history, science, math, or foreign language, ideally in your junior year or your senior year. It's great if you have a teacher who's taught you twice. If it's somebody that you've worked with, say in 9th grade and then again in 11th grade, so they've kind of seen that growth and that progression in you as a student over the course of having them in a couple of different classes. Teachers that might be able to offer an additional multiple perspective, a teacher who you have as a club advisor or as a coach, someone that you've worked closely with who knows you inside the classroom, but also can offer the perspective of you as a student or as a person outside of the classroom. That can be a really nice addition to the recommendation. And think of the teachers who know you well. Who are those teachers that you're spending time with after school? Who are the teachers that you seek out for help after school? The teachers that really know the type of work ethic that you have. Don't worry about the grade that you got in the class. It actually may be more effective, a recommendation may be more effective coming from a teacher of a class that you struggled in a little bit, but the teacher understands how hard you worked and how much you earned that grade because you stayed after school and put in the extra work. It's not just, oh, I'm going to ask this teacher because I got an A in that class. Maybe that's great. Maybe you learn the material well and you got the A in the class, but the teacher doesn't really know who you are. So don't worry so much about, a teacher's not going to write in a recommendation, typically, oh, the student didn't do all that well in my class. What a teacher might say is, I know that this subject, whether it's biology or chemistry or pre-calculus or whatever it might be, I know that this subject wasn't a strength for the student. I know that they struggled to earn every grade that they did, and I'm so proud of the work that they put into it. That sometimes can say more to a college admissions officer about how a student is going to be in the classroom in college than a teacher who says, yep, they understood the material, participated in class, and they got an A. So just a couple of other things to think about as you're thinking about teachers to ask for recommendation. how to ask. This is another area that can cause a lot of stress for students, how to go about asking a teacher. So really, once you've sat down and thought about the teachers that you want to ask, and you're making some good, solid selections of the teachers that you want to ask to write your recommendation, this isn't something that you want to take lightly. It's not something that you want to do, kind of on the fly, after class, say, hey, by the way. Try to make an appointment to talk with the teacher. And when you go, be prepared. Give the teacher a copy of your resume or your brag sheet, whatever you may have had put together. Talk to them a little bit about the colleges that you're looking at, about your college search, and tell them why you've selected him or her, that it's not just, you're going to check it off as another teacher that you've asked. Tell them, this is why I picked you. I thought specifically that you knew me well because of my involvement in the sports team that you're also coaching, and you're also my teacher in class. I chose you because you've been my teacher for 2 years now in this subject, and I thought that that would be helpful. I chose you because I didn't really like the material in the class that you taught me. That I really struggled, but I also think that you know how hard I worked. So those are all some things to think about, making sure that you are taking it seriously, asking them with plenty of time, and I'll get into a little bit on the next slide with when to ask. But the how is an important part as well. And I know sometimes students are really nervous about what if the teacher says no. If the teacher says no, you ask another teacher. Honestly, if the teacher says no, then, it's probably with good reason. It doesn't mean anything against you as a student, and hopefully the teacher will give you a reason. It might be that they just have too many on their plate, or maybe they know that their strength isn't in writing recommendations. So what you want to think about is if the teacher agrees immediately to writing a recommendation, then have the confidence that he or she knows that they can write a really strong letter for you. If for any reason the teacher hesitates or says no, then you know what? They hesitate, say, thanks, I'll check back with you in a few days, don't worry about it, and then move on to somebody else. It's a kind of another way that it gives you a little bit of control over the process. So, just think thoughtfully about teachers that you think will say yes, teachers that you want to ask you. But if for some reason someone says no or is a little bit hesitant, really try not to read any more into it than they just may have some other things going on, and that there's a better person who knows you better, who can write a better recommendation for you. Okay, when to ask. This is another important piece of things. I always recommend to my students to ask prior to the end of junior year. As you probably know, or maybe you hear from some other friends, when senior year starts, it's kind of this, big rush to get things done, and students are approaching their typically English teachers or math teachers or whoever they're going to write for recommendations. They're approaching them in the first couple of weeks of senior year when things are already busy, or even worse, they're waiting until maybe the end of September and they're saying, oh, I'm applying for November 1st for early action or early decision deadlines. Can you get this recommendation in? And if the teacher says yes at that point, then you're probably going into an already large queue. So my advice is to definitely get in ahead of the game and ask prior to the end of junior year. I usually recommend, if you have a spring break, whether it's a March break or an April break, asking sometime after that. One of the other reasons I really like asking before the end of junior year, especially if you're asking a teacher who's currently teaching you, is that now the ball is in your court and you have the opportunity to make sure that you're continuing to participate in class and really putting forth your best effort when you know that this teacher has already agreed to write a recommendation for you. And I also think it gives the teacher a nice opportunity to really pay a little bit more attention in how they're observing you in the classroom and using that information to write in your recommendation, as opposed to waiting until September when you might ask a teacher who you had the year before who might say, oh gee, I really wish I could recall a little bit more about how you were in the classroom specifically, but it's already passed because they weren't really focusing on it all that much. Whereas if you ask them before the end of junior year, they have the extra time, have the time to focus on that. And like I said, be more attentive in the class once you've asked. You don't want to just rest easy once they've said, sure, I'll write a recommendation for you. You want to make sure that you're still participating in the class and doing the best that you can. So a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts and recommendation process. So high schools typically have their own guidelines and expectations as to how recommendations are sent. So certainly you'll want to give the people writing letters for you a list of the colleges that you're applying to and their due dates. In many cases, teachers submit letters electronically right through Naviance if your high school uses something called Naviance. However, if a teacher wants to or has to send a letter in the mail, it's up to you to make sure that that teacher has all of the forms with your information completed well in advance of the deadlines. And it's also really nice if you give them, and this isn't quite as necessary anymore, but if you have a teacher who prefers to send something in, in the mail, then you should provide them with the labels to the colleges and the envelopes as well when you give them the information to write the recommendation. If you're using the Common application, there is a teacher recommendation form on the Common application, as well as a counselor recommendation form called a school report, that usually, even if a school is not on the Common App, they'll typically accept that form. So many things are done electronically now, but you can download a copy of those forms if you wanted to give them to a teacher specifically if they request that for you. So again, one thing you want to pay attention to is whatever dates your guidance counselor sets for when they want information into them so that they can make sure they get your recommendations in on time. That's important to get to the guidance counselor and to the teacher to let them know with it plenty of time, okay, I'm applying for November 1st deadline, I'm applying for November 15th deadline, that they have plenty of time. I mean, really, you want to understand that teachers are often writing a lot of recommendations, specifically English teachers. I'm sure that you all know at your school who the teachers are who are popular to be asked for recommendations. That's another really important reason to ask early in the process, because you don't want to be one of the last ones to get in their queue, but also be respectful of their time. Be respectful of the time of the teacher. Don't ask them at the last minute. Make sure that you're aware of the deadlines that your school has set and that you're able to meet those deadlines with plenty of time. Within the Common application this year, the Common App launched a new release this year, so you're able to actually go in either through Naviance and through the Common application and assign teachers to different colleges. For the first time this year on the Common App, a school may require one recommendation, but they'll allow two, or they may require one and only allow one. So if you have two recommendations, you need to decide which recommendation you're going to send to that school. So we'll allow you to do that either within Naviance or within the Common App. But it's important to know that as of this year, and it will be the case going forward, you need to make a distinction. In the past, guidance counselors have typically just sent all recommendations, uploaded them onto the Common App, but that's a little bit different this year. So you just need to be able to decide which recommendation you want to go to which school. Another really important part of the process is following up with teachers. So again, you've asked them to take a part in your application process. You've asked them to write a recommendation on your behalf. You've gone about things thoughtfully and professionally with making an appointment to ask them ahead of time. Once they've written the recommendation for you, it's really nice to write them. I prefer a handwritten thank you note to each teacher. Email is okay, but I prefer the handwritten note. Just really saying, thank you for taking the time for writing a recommendation for me. I've enjoyed having you as a teacher. I really appreciate your participation in my application process. Just something like that. And it's also, you just certainly don't want to nag your teachers, but it is also appropriate to check in with them from time to time to make sure that they have whatever they need from you and that they know what your deadlines are. You also have to understand, again, in addition to teaching the classes that they're teaching and all the other responsibilities that the teachers have, they're also writing a fair number of recommendations. So just check in from time to time. Just want to make sure that you have what you need from me. Is there anything else that you need? And then you just want to kind of continue to check in. You don't want it to be you ask them in April and then in October 1st the recommendation isn't done and you go to them in a panic. You just need to follow up from time to time. So that's a little bit of information, kind of a general overview about how to go about getting a strong recommendation. As I said in the beginning, it's really how to elevate your recommendation from an average recommendation by a teacher who maybe clearly doesn't know you that well, and elevating it to a really strong recommendation from somebody who clearly knows you. I can tell you from my time in admissions that there were times where, and there were specific guidance counselors that I got to know as I read more applications from certain schools who just did a phenomenal job, who would just really take the time, and I knew the students well, and you could that relationship would come through on the page, and you'd really get a better sense and a better perspective of who that student was, and it would help you make a more effective admissions decision. So recommendations are an important part of the process. So I'm happy if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to take any questions from you about the recommendation process.
Great, thanks, Beth. So yeah, we do have some questions here.
Sure.
Um, the
Okay.
first one is, in addition to the two teacher letters, is it ever okay to ask a coach who has never had you in the classroom but knows you well for a letter of recommendation?
It is, as long as the outside, what we would call an outside or additional recommendation, is offering a different perspective, one that they're not, that the college is not already going to get from someone, from a teacher or from a counselor or something like that, then definitely, go ahead and ask for that outside recommendation. There is a part of the Common App now where, as of this year, where students can actually go in, called Other Recommender, and request that person to write a recommendation for them online, and they can actually upload it right to your Common App from there. The thing to watch out for with that, as I mentioned before, is just keeping an eye on colleges that only require, or that only allow a certain number to be submitted, and then just making sure that whether or not you want that one to be included as one of the however many, one, two, or three that the college will accept. Anything like that that can give an additional perspective, if it's an employer, if it's a coach, if you're involved with music and it's an instructor or a teacher or something like that that you've had outside of school, a dance teacher, all of those things can also go to giving an outside perspective.
Great. What about on Common App where it allows for recommendations from a peer or parent? How does that tie in?
Mm-hmm. So there are some schools, I know Dartmouth asked for a peer recommendation. I know that there are some schools that will allow parents to submit recommendations. It seems to be becoming a little bit more popular to allow a parent recommendation. I can tell you in my time in admissions at Bryant that it wasn't something that we looked at very closely. If we got a recommendation from a parent, I'm not sure I ever remember getting a recommendation from a peer. That seems to be something that's a little bit new too. But I know there are some colleges out there, especially if a student is applying early decision, that will encourage a parent to submit a recommendation. It's certainly a nice opportunity for a parent to get to talk about their child, and if the school is asking for that, then I think that that's okay. If the school is not asking for that, then I would not recommend that a parent send a recommendation for that, just because it's still, I mean, it's clearly biased. It's supposed to be. I mean, they're your children. But I would really say, unless a college is specifically asking for it or specifically says something about submit one if you'd like, I wouldn't submit it to just all schools.
Thank you. What about homeschooled students? What should they do?
Homeschooled students should, follow the same process of getting um, some sort of recommendation from someone that they've had contact with over their time in school. If they've been able to have a job, that would be helpful. If they've been involved in some sort of sporting event or some sort of class or church or wherever that circle of the community for that student is, they should find an adult or someone that they look up to, whether it's a teacher of some sort or a leader, and ask them for recommendation of a perspective. I know sometimes students go to camp over the summer, all students, not just homeschooled students, and they may ask their camp counselor or the head of camp for a recommendation. You really want to be thinking thoughtfully about people that know you well. So I think that would, absolutely, as a homeschooled student, you want to let the college know about what your experience has been, what your extracurricular, although it's not traditional extracurricular involvement in a school necessarily, what have you done, and what have the people that you've been around, seen in you and seen how you've grown and what you can bring to the college.
We have a question asking, what if English is not the teacher's first language? And I guess this ties into a larger question or theme of,
Mhm.
should you target a teacher in part based on how eloquent they are, or how good a writer they are? How should students
Mhm.
factor that in?
Sure, I get that question a lot. I know that can be tough, if there's some kind of a language barrier, or if English isn't a first language and they're a little bit curious about the teachers, how the teacher's quality of writing and how they're going to get the message across. I always think that guidance counselors are a really good resource for that. Guidance counselors see lots of recommendations for lots of students from pretty much every teacher in the school at one point or another. So I will typically say, and it's not in a negative way at all. I will typically recommend that students, talk with their guidance counselor if they have some questions about, should I ask this teacher or this teacher, and see what the guidance counselor says. They might say, something, she writes really strong recommendations, or they might say, you know what, these are, they're a little bit more standard, or they're not, quite as eloquent as some other ones. I will also say, from having read recommendations, admissions is really trying to just get who you are. So your teacher doesn't have to be the best writer, out there, and it doesn't have to be the most, eloquent writer either. Really, it's what they're saying about the student, and as long as that message is coming through, correctly and clearly, that's really what we're looking for. I will say, I remember, reading recommendations where you could tell that it was a form letter, to the point that, a teacher just inserted the wrong student's name, or they would have, the student who the application was for, their name was in the recommendation 3/4 of the way through, and then they had to switch to a different name in the last paragraph. You never hold that against a student. It shouldn't happen. It's an unfortunate thing that does happen sometimes, but that would never be held against a student in a negative way in the application process, because that's not something that's the student's fault. I hope
Thank
that
you.
answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. A question about all things being equal,
Okay.
is it preferable for a student to get a recommendation from a teacher whose class they've always succeeded in and gotten straight A's, or is it better
Mhm.
to pick a teacher who, a class where they struggled at first but have overcome adversity and are now successful?
Um, I mean, I think, all things being equal, I think that sometimes there's more strength of character shown when you've had to overcome some adversity. Especially if for a student, it's the first time they have. If you're a student who's who's, used to getting, strong grades, and you work hard for the grades, but all of a sudden you find yourself in a class where this is just a whole new ball game for you, and you are, not used to kind of being the one, being the one that struggles, then that can really kind of add something to the application to say, something, this was um, a new position for the student to be in, and they rose to the challenge. They didn't drop the class and switch to a lower level. They stuck with it, and they worked hard, and in their final grade, shows that growth.
Thanks. If a college says no recommendation is required, should a student
Mhm.
still send one? Is that ever advisable?
Um, I think if a college says no recommendation is required, I would still send a recommendation, as long as they. I can't think of a school off the top of my head that does that, but as long as there's a school that says, please don't send us recommendations, as a college counselor, I err on the side of, I would rather the college have the information and not use it, than not have the information and be looking for it, or be saying, gee, why didn't they? At Bryant, we used to require, they only require one recommendation, and students would frequently submit two. If a school says they don't require any recommendations, or they require one, and you submit five, that's overkill. There is such a thing as too many recommendations. After a while, you start to wonder why the student feels that they need so many people to kind of, write on their behalf, especially when they're asking people, who either don't know them. I know I used to get recommendations sometimes from, congressmen or senators or something like that, which is nice if they know you. If it's someone who doesn't know you, it's honestly really not going to add anything to your application. So I guess to kind of circle back to the original question, I am always happy to fax a recommendation over for a student if it's an outside recommendation, or to have their teacher fax it over or send it in the mail. It's always nice. You don't want a college to be looking for information. You'd rather them have it there if they want to use it, and if they don't, then there was nothing lost in that.
Thanks. What about a school? We have a student who says they go to a huge school, 800 students in the senior class, and they doubt their counselor recommendation will be very personal. Is it okay to not submit a counselor recommendation
Mm-hmm.
uh, where that's optional?
On, on if a counselor recommendation is optional, then it's okay to not in its place. For the most part, that counselor recommendation is the one that's required across the board, because it's sort of one thing that can help put students on a level playing field, that everyone typically has a guidance counselor. However, there's also a school report that goes along with the guidance counselor recommendation that will give the size of the school. We'll ask the counselor how long they've known the student and kind of what capacity they've known the student. So if it's a high school class of, 500, 600 students, there is just no way that the guidance counselor is going to get the time to know them. That being said, if that is the situation that you're in, it's a good time to try to meet with your guidance counselor when you can. I know that they're really busy, and I know that they have a lot that's going on, a lot of students to see. But if it's, you're still in your you're still before senior year, you have the opportunity to kind of change that and make sure that you do try to get to know them. The other couple of things that I've seen in the past is I have seen teachers or a counselor that will write as part of the recommendation, um, I don't know the student that well. I will be honest. I haven't, known the student for that long. Please accept a recommendation from this teacher in place of the counselor recommendation. If the guidance counselor gives the okay on that, I would always accept that as fine in its place. I know that happens sometimes. There are often maternity leaves, or they change counselor assignments in senior year, and all of a sudden you've had the same counselor for 3+ years, and now in the fall of your senior year you have a brand new counselor, and that causes a lot of anxiety for students. Sometimes what will happen is that the previous year's counselor will submit the recommendation on the student's behalf. So basically, if a guidance counselor recommendation is required, as it typically is, but you're not comfortable with your guidance counselor submitting the recommendation, or think that they don't know you as well, if you can have the guidance counselor specifically say, accept this recommendation on my behalf, on behalf of the student, this teacher knows the student better than I do, then I think that's perfectly acceptable.
Thanks. What about making sure that the recommender doesn't drop the ball and gets the letter in on time and all that? What's kind of I know there's a fine line between being a nuisance and just making sure that they get it in. What do you recommend
Right,
to the students in terms of just making sure that that gets
right.
submitted?
I think it's important to check in, appropriately, every, 2 to 3 weeks or so, just not from the sense of, have you gotten my recommendation done yet? Just, say, just want to make sure that you have everything from me, and it's really important that you give the teacher the list of schools that you're applying to and the list of deadlines that you're applying for, and your school's deadlines for when the school needs to have the information into them about where you're applying, so that the teacher knows to meet those recommendations. If you're finding that you are really just not, the teacher's not being very responsive, or you feel like they're not, um, going to get things in, you're getting a little bit nervous about that, then that's an appropriate time to get the guidance counselor involved. And it's not to try to get the teacher in trouble, but it's okay to, go to the guidance counselor and say, I asked such and such teacher, months ago for recommendation. I've checked in. They said they need everything, that they're working on it, but I'm getting really nervous. And then the guidance counselor can, hopefully just kind of check in with the teacher and say, oh, hey, putting together applications for this student. Notice that you're on the list. Just want to make sure that we're going to be able to get that in so we can get the students' applications in on time. That's not necessarily the first course, is to go to the guidance counselor. You want to kind of, appropriately, every 2 to 3 weeks or so, ask the teacher. But if you feel like you're not getting what you need from the teacher, and you feel like you've asked them with plenty of time and given them all the information, then I think it's appropriate to go to the guidance counselor and see if they can help push things along a little bit.
Thanks. So that was the final question. So any last
Mhm.
pieces of advice, Beth, maybe some advice for current seniors and then some advice for juniors or younger on what they should do in the coming months?
Sure. I think, for current seniors, you're probably right in the swing of things, and, trying to get your applications completed. I'm sure that some of you may have experienced some issues with the Common App. I know it was down yesterday, and I got some frantic emails from students saying, what's going to happen if I don't, if the Common App doesn't come back up and I can't apply to school? I think one thing is, I know there's a lot of stress around this time. Um, and one of the ways that you can release some of that stress is, first of all, the Common App is going to work itself out. And if it doesn't, students certainly aren't going to be penalized for that. So don't worry about that. You will still be able to apply to your schools. And I think it's just, important as a senior to first and foremost work on keeping your grades up, and still, being attentive in the classroom, especially after a teacher's written a recommendation for you. That's not a license to say, okay, now I can slack off. You want to continue to show this teacher why they took the time to accept writing the recommendation for you and to write something on your behalf. And I think if you really prioritize things and making sure that you're getting your schoolwork done, making sure that you're working diligently on your applications, and don't forget to take some time to have fun. It's a big year. It's your senior year, so I always encourage students to enjoy it. That's why the sooner your applications are submitted, the sooner you can kind of focus on some of those other things without that big, application process hanging over your head. For juniors, it's a good time now to start thinking about who you might want to be. You're just getting into your classes for junior year. Start thinking about who you might want to be asking for recommendations. Start thinking about colleges you might want to be looking at. And I mean, even students younger than junior year, it's never too early to start to build those relationships with your teachers and with your counselors. You will see that that is an important part of the process. I think students find, and it's usually kind of the realization, in senior year, that your application is so many other people talking about you. Your transcript is submitted by your guidance counselor, and your SAT scores are taken by you, but submitted by the college board, and recommendations are other people writing things about you. So those are very important factors in the process. So it's important to take the time to build some of those relationships now. Get to know your guidance counselor. They're a great resource. Make sure that you are, getting to know your teachers, that you're not just walking in and out of class, and that you're participating in class, because you don't know, even if right now you think, I probably wouldn't ask them for a recommendation. You don't know if a year from now, or 2 years from now, that's going to be a different situation or a different story. So you want to be kind of focused on that from the beginning now, and really just keeping, mind of the fact that you're trying to put your best foot forward in your application process. And there are things that you can do now, like establishing those relationships that can pay off a couple years down the road.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Beth. Really appreciate it. Some great advice there. Everyone, thank you for your time and for joining us. We will send out a recording of this webinar as well as an email where you can follow up with any additional questions you have. So thank you, everyone, for your time, and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.